lecture series all that to the post-colonial. I don't know how many of you have been to all the lectures, but I suspect some of you, this is your first lecture, so I'll just say a quick few words of introduction. Professor Simone is a research chair at the Planck Institute at Göttingen. He's renowned for his work on cities. He's really transformed our thinking on how cities of the South should be imagined and what goes on in them. And in the series here, he's been talking about how the poor and working people in general make their lives, and in ways which have been very poorly recognized both in scholarship and in policy. And operative concepts in his work in the lectures here have been the uninhabitable, which he defines as a kind of rhythm of endurance. And he's, for those of you who were here in the first two lectures, in the first one, these rhythms of endurance in part included his own autobiography, or rather the biography of those cities where he grew up. And in the second lecture, he took us to two other cities which he studied, and today his insights on the uninhabitable will be from the city of Delhi, where he's recently begun some fieldwork of both the general nature, but also a detailed ethnography in one of these cities, Muslim neighborhoods. So, please welcome Professor Simone once again.
Thank you everyone for coming out tonight. Thank you for your interest, patience, endurance. So I've been embedded with Jesus for the last week. And because of that, I thought probably would start out tonight with some rock and roll scriptures. So in Surah azzumar, we read that Allah created you from a single being, then made its mate of the same kind. And He sent down for you 8 of the cattle in pairs. He creates you in the wombs of your mothers, creation after creation in triple darkness. This is Allah, your Lord, this is the kingdom. This verse has been subject to many interpretations and used for many purposes. If a world for humanity has largely been constructed by rendering it uninhabitable for those who have been stripped of their humanity, when they may not have desired or conceived of themselves as human in the first place, then that world can neither be redeemed by the practices of those who have endured without it, for they offer only the hastening of the end they have already experienced, nor can that world remake itself without those very practices. This conundrum, not being able to turn to those who have been the subjects of abjection, nor to disavow their possibility of inheriting the earth, is the grounds of creation in darkness. It's not a matter of simply handing over the keys to the oppressed, for they have already been driven off. It is not a matter of starting over, here or somewhere else, or of evacuating the sense of humanity altogether in arriving at the singularity. Darkness is both condition and cover, and under the cover of darkness emerges forms of rogue care and strange alliances, inexplicable and provision. A trinity, then, of darkness. Now, conventional interpretations point to largely spatial distinctions of darkness, of a world created from darkness, of individuals whose initial period of gestation takes place in the darkness of the womb, and whose future life trajectories are subject to the darkness of uncertainty. These interpretations center on the will of Allah, whose contents remain unknown, as do the processes of deliberation, if any, which determine that will. For the individual who lives, who may seek to live a life according to all that has been specified by her Creator, there is both the certainty of redemption, but also the knowledge that any final judgment is not hers to make. Other instances of exegesis for this particular surah have emphasized the internal subversion of this very process, where triple darkness refers to a process of continuous invention that may rest ultimately in the authority of Allah, but whose creations remain unknown to everyone. Here, Allah is simply the power of the contingent beyond anticipation or calculation, beyond the sovereign decision. If you are created from a single being, then is this the same for the fabrication of the mate? The grounding of the relationship, then, of self and other remains in the dark. The surah tells us the basics, but leaves the details somewhere else. In African American eschatological traditions, this verse has often been viewed as a reminder of both the curse and the potentials of the abruption of genealogy. Slavery was a brutal cut in the connection of a people with their land, culture, and capacity to institutionalize their version of humanity or a version without it. A people whose darkness threw them into a state of darkness, of separation and condemnation. It compelled their need to reinvent themselves without the certainty of cultural coherence, of the dark remaking a version of humanity in the dark. In doing so, through long processing, through long periods of suffering and struggle, solidarity and improvisation, all of the historical narratives that explain how things came about and how the world was made were upended. Those that were slaves consigned these narratives to darkness. So while the womb may be the signifier of the possibility of the trace, of tracing where people have come from, and what such antecedents may mean as the legacy to the future, genealogy largely operates in the dark. Nothing has to be what it seems to be. All places of anchorage and inhabitation, all domains from which to start a story of things are unsettled. There is nothing definitively there to ensure anything but a middle passage. Triple darkness is, of course, a conceptual imposition. For how does one see and experience supposedly distinct levels of darkness? Doesn't it all become a kind of a blur? The blackness of black, as the constituent of darkness, destabilizes the very notion of the human who might perceive it, and thus can be experienced only as an object detached from any social implication. In Delhi, full of struggles and sufferings of people trying to find a place to live, to avoid expulsion, to survive through the extinguishing of so many things of value, the city in part endures through the absence of a world. In its juxtapositions and jarring frictions, there is not an inhabitable city, despite all of the efforts to render it world-class and smart. In many respects, Delhi stubbornly holds on to its constant demise, and in doing so, and despite every intention to suppress it, creates the cover of darkness and the opportunities for rogue care. I had been coming to this spot for days simply to watch, and no one took notice, except one guy who said he had seen me over the past days and wondered what I was doing there. So we got to know each other a little bit, enough to learn that the guy had some special talents. And over the course of several weeks, I would hear more precisely what those talents were about. So Shaheen Ahmed emerges from the vegetable market off of Brahmanpuri Road in New Seelampur with 4 large sacks of onions slung over his back, and quickly dumps them in the back of his motorized 3-wheeled cart and sets off to deliver them to a restaurant a few kilometers away in Jafrabad. There are thousands of people in this area of Delhi engaged in the same occupation, but perhaps not so many who are able to anticipate what they will encounter en route with such comprehensive accuracy. At first, I was reasonably incredulous about Shahid's claims to be able to detail all of the small incidental events that he would pass through on the way to the many destinations he had to cover during the course of the day. For example, on Street 15, near the Cheap Emporium, he would rightly predict that there would be a minor accident involving a rickshaw and an unattended pedestrian, or that by Markazi Chowk there would be an argument among some tenants and owners that would spill out onto the street, resulting in slowed traffic for over 1 hour. These predictions were made well in advance of their eventual confirmation. The point of this apparent clairvoyance was not so much to predict a future for its own sake, but rather as a means for Shahid to decide how to traverse his rounds most efficiently and with the greatest speed. He didn't work for a company. He owned his own vehicle and built up a reputation for timely deliveries managed through SMS or WhatsApp on his cell phone. Most of his work entailed orders that would come up at the last minute when a business unexpectedly ran out of something or had to get something somewhere in a hurry. Many of his customers were responding to an unexpected opportunity when a task or an order broke down somewhere else, and in order to do the job they needed some additional tools or supplies. In a world of exigencies then, Shahid also had the capacity to stagger and readjust the temporalities of delivery. He might already be on his way to a particular destination when a call or text would come indicating a higher degree of urgency, usually in closer proximity than where he was headed. So over the years, he had set up a series of temporary in-transit storage depots with friends and associates who had a workshop, shed, or spot under the freeway, or in the courtyard of a mosque. Some place where he could leave things for usually less than an hour if the original request was not pressing. The capacity to take on additional complexity thus required a capacity to reduce complexity in other areas. The task was to foresee all of those occurrences that might result in delays. Of course, he didn't need to be some exorbitant soothsayer in order to know how to read the patterns or traffic flows at different times of day. All the lulls and surges that accompany school schedules and factory shifts and commutes, or the probability of disruptions at precarious intersections or roads saturated with commerce, and the haphazard improvised layouts of much of the surrounding built environment. At any given moment, it's also possible for someone with Shahid's acquired familiarity with all the different approaches to any specific location to feel out a prevailing atmosphere, sense a tension in the air, a more frenetic pace of movement, or a calm before the storm. A heightened capacity for prediction is imminent in such repetitive immersions. At the same time, no matter how familiar a driver is with all the mathematical permutations of possible routes, all the thickening of choke points and the sieves of back alleys, all the possible triggers for slowdowns and interruptions, unanticipated situations always crop up. Events that are not so strange in retrospect, but whose occurrence, of course, can't really be foreseen. Shahid's apparent capacity in this regard provided him an almost miraculous advantage to guarantee precise delivery times without having to waste energy inventing excuses. while those placing the orders were always relieved with the promptness of Shahid's deliveries, I also suspected that they were also somewhat disappointed, sometimes even alarmed by such efficiency. Perhaps because they themselves were looking for an excuse to dock the delivery price, or assumed that punctuality in Delhi was an impossibility, and thus concluded, rightly in Shahid's case, that some supernatural powers must be involved. Yet, regardless of this sentiment, they almost never failed to retain Shahid for future deliveries, and simply became willing participants in promoting his reputation far and wide. Shahid claimed the ability to coax events from the darkness of an unknown future, to see in his mind the unfolding of scenarios before they actually took place. But for Shahid, this capacity was incidental to something he calls the other side, a side that would never emerge as a distinct thing, but yet remain somehow omnipresent in all that did take place. For what Shahid valued was a capacity that could never be confirmed, that was simply his to ascertain and experience. Whereas foreseeing what was about to take place could always be confirmed by whether or not that which was foreseen actually did occur. For what was more important for Shahid was his professed ability to see an entire social world submerged in darkness, a world that could never be subjected to empirical validation. We might all sense that an entire choreography of social relationships takes place that cannot be adequately accounted for by the available expository vernaculars. We might believe that all kinds of strange occurrences and alliances are operative for us day after day, something that goes beyond the common invocations of big persons manipulating events behind the scenes or the work of jinns. But what Shahid claimed was not so much to know all those forces shrouded in mystery, secreted behind the limitations of ordinary awareness, but rather entire configurations of social life that most likely would never emerge from the darkness, an entire world of social interchange, couplings, and proximities that never quite make it to the outside, to the real world. At the same time, for Shahid, this real world was the very door, the very materiality of the darkness in which was submerged a society free from all of the usual conventions of recognition. It wasn't that he gazed into some different space or retreated to his dreams or looked to the heavens above. Rather, his entire surrounds were the tissue of this darkness. Yet this tissue was only a surface without depth. It wasn't that the surface was the scheme, protector, or extrusion of some secreted cause. For, as Shahid explained, what we see together is thoroughly detached from that which remains in the dark. In fact, that surface, he says, is always shifting sands and details, with nothing holding it together, which is why the literacy he develops from his occupation, from his constant traversing the eastern districts of Delhi, is for him never sufficient. I ask him what good all this does, what seeing the social vitality of the darkness actually accomplishes in his life. These are questions he shrugs off, that he sees as irrelevant to his actual experiences. For him, what he foresees in advance is not then constructed as a reality that has been predetermined. It isn't that he senses something that has been inscribed in advance and that he simply gets the jump on everyone else in an advanced preview. Instead, the immersion in the darkness he describes convinces him that what does occur need not have happened. That in fact, there might be things taking place that are simply not seen or experienced. Things not necessarily related to what does take place, but in their simultaneity posit unanswerable queries as to whether or not what indeed is transpiring is the only thing going on. While Shahid was always adamant that there were no mediations between what was actually foreseen and what could never be foreseen in his realms of dark navigation, it was through Shahid that I learned of a small initiative underway in New Zealandport to bring some of the potentials of these dark configurations into the ordinary realities of some of its residents. It was through Shahid that I met the son of a restaurant owner in Jafrabad who just happened to be there the day visiting his parents and helped take a sack of onions into the kitchen. It was this son, Nuri, who was involved in trying to find ways to activate a dynamic Islamic practice in New Zealandport that might spark more confidence for its residents, small entrepreneurs, to try to do care for each other in a different kind of way. Something that he did with his friends, Malik, Sabir, Amina, Latifa, and Nabi. I am by no means any expert on Delhi. I have never engaged in the prolonged periods of residence or work there. I feel even somewhat embarrassed to say anything about the city in light of the remarkable body of urban writing that emanates from it. But it is this chance encounter with Shahid and Nuri that has instigated this modest attempt to foreground the small ways in which a working-class district in Delhi, New Zealandport, attempts to circumvent being stuck in a world where it does not seem to count for much of anything. And in the following thoughts about Delhi, I am really deeply indebted to Gautam Bhan from the Indian Institute of Human Settlements for helping to organize discussions with residents, urban development professionals, and activists. Delhi is a vast agglomeration and disjunction of heterogeneous elements, overlaps, mutant entities, and highly standardized and formatted zones of administration. Although it's possible to narrate many intricate histories of dispositions of Delhi, and indeed the urban scholarship on the metropolitan region is really some of the best in existence, there remains some mystery as to why Delhi is so unable to complete itself as some kind of coherent urban world. In other words, a mystery remains as to why the urban region remains in intensive contiguity of apparent disparities whose connective tissue often is more spontaneously generated than being an object of planning and administration. That said, and as Sanjay Srinivastava points out, the lives and places of the city are thoroughly entangled with each other as the city reaches for ever new, ever elusive manifestations of coherence. In Delhi, calling a place a backward Muslim area is a familiar means of disqualification. By applying it to a particular location, then everything appears to be somehow explained. From the outset, Seelampur was mostly characterized as impoverished and dysfunctional. This attribution neglected the systematic ways in which a substrate of residents, usually not part of the original resettlement process, but rather acquiring property on various submarkets, created an elaborate factory floor built across hundreds of small independent units. These residents engaged in frequent struggles with state authorities over their efforts to upscale industrial production. Also, they faced limitations on developing plants in formally designated industrial zones. And because of these limitations, they sought to upscale production through the articulation of small lanes that hosted both residential and manufacturing functions. Through this spatializing of manufacturers and spawning of heterogeneous specializations, this substrate, depending upon new streams of migrant labor, sought to manage more advantageous positions within commodity streams. They did this largely through expanding the capacity to address niche markets. As such, what is referred to as Seelampur does not necessarily correspond to its designated administrative boundaries. Rather, to call Seelampur, to invoke the name Seelampur, is a varied topography of roads, sites, neighborhoods, and infrastructures that fall within the same broad geographic area, but which are developed differentially. They are developed differentially in order to generate a multivalent series of advantages, costs, capacities, and divisions of labor that are not easily governed and often must find fairly rigid frameworks of coordination in order to be held together. That said, Seelampur experiences a poverty and income disparity rate greater than that of Delhi as a whole. It's plagued by poor infrastructural conditions, where in an intensely vertical urbanized setting, nearly a quarter of households don't got indoor plumbing of any kind, where open drainage prevails, garbage collection is scant, and where localities have to mobilize inordinate political capital in order to attain even the semblance of adequate maintenance and repair. Police implicitly encourage drug trafficking. The persistence of caste stratification within Muslim districts often impedes the capacities of Muslims to overturn or branch out from constricted economic relationships in specific sectors. So the voice of Islam, the invocation of Islam, the voice of Islam, is increasingly the voice of investment for a younger generation of residents. Enfolding certain doctrinal versions of Islam into one's vocabulary or everyday practice becomes a way of accessing finance that enables Muslims to go beyond simply being manufacturers in the Trans-Yamuna belt of East Delhi to the purveyors of their own trading circuits. For as Hazala Jamil points out, the brokers in Delhi, the garment business, the spare parts and machine parts manufacturing, the scrap dealing, in all of these areas, Muslims have been kept in the lowest rung of the business due to a mix of spatial segregation, lack of credit facilities, and discriminatory practices. Up until a few years ago, there had only been one bank in all of New Seelampur. And New Seelampur is Delhi's most dense colony, with 35,000 inhabitants per square kilometer. But what Muslims lack in commercial power, they have attempted to compensate with coverage, penetrating and becoming skilled in all kinds of fabrication, recycling, and retrofitting. While spatial segregation provides a sense of protection, a shortcut to mobilizing labor and managing everyday complexity, in some areas of Seelampur, opportunism outweighs these considerations. As successful manufacturers relocate their residences to more middle-class environments just to the north in Jafrabad, some lanes of their former quarters have been opened up to low-end non-Muslim entrepreneurs in tentative experiments of how new forms of income generation and to intentionally cultivate an atmosphere of heterogeneity. This heterogeneity is not necessarily an active substance of everyday transactions. Rather, it's more a guise or diversion, a way of muddying the waters in a way in which particular neighborhood blocks are apprehended by the outside world. In Seelampur, there had been a large lower caste Valmiki Hindu population, which purportedly has mostly moved out of Seelampur, but this is a disposition that varies lane by lane by lane, as some non-Muslim households don't have the means to go elsewhere, and have dug in terms of consolidating particular sectors of work. This work often mirrors that of their Muslim neighbors, but participates in different commercial networks so as to avoid obvious competition. Yet at the same time, these parallel tracks lend support to the overall sectors of fabrication, articulating Seelampur to a wider expanse of the country and beyond. And so Seelampur has become one of Asia's largest scrapyards, dealing with scrapyards for electrical waste. Some back alleys are full of circuit boards, cathode ray tubes and wires, LEDs, capacitors, transistors and condensers, with workers taking out whatever can be recycled and sold. There's a major industry centered on making televisions out of recycled CRTs. So, Selampur, new and old, draws in on itself, making denser an already thick coagulant through an almost parasitical relationship to itself. It feeds on its proliferations of trajectories, commodity circuits, circulating bodies, and the wear and tear of its materiality to eke out one more extension. And it's not an outward extension necessary, nor a clear subdividing of what is already there, but rather a crowdedness of hinges, a crowdedness of idiosyncratic encounters, provisional incitements and engagements. This is not an environment that provides a place or a habitat for fully fledged subjects, but rather ones that both cohere and tear apart the settling of any fabric. This is a contaminated tissue, full of the grounding of entities into a rush of particulates. And like both compost and superhighways, it constitutes a surface able to hold almost everything in their repetitive and improvised maneuvers, even if what they do hold becomes increasingly strange to each other. The residents live with an irreconcilable simultaneity of different forms of vision. They may not share Shahid's gifts, but they cannot simply rest with one way of seeing things. To endure an environment so full of things and events in such close proximity to each other, where the use of physical distance as a device for spacing things out is of limited use, one must look straight ahead, filter out a limited working discourse in symbolic fields from what then becomes noise. But at the same time, the chaos of things incites lateral vision, the perception of detours and digressions, a profusion of images with nowhere to go except towards each other, towards an eventual extinguishing of sense, where each different facet of what is going on offers another exit from wherever one finds themselves now. Okay. The districts of Selampur are sites of excessive energy, full of cascading surges and attenuations. Speed up, slow down. The grinding repetitiveness of labor across small factories and workshops conceals other rhythms made up of rash experiments and investments, sudden decisions to take up different trades temporarily, retreats into distant shrines, surges of sometimes amphetamine extended work hours, surprise visits, convivial exchanges that cannot find a ready conclusion. The day in and day out may resound, but it provides cover for many other itineraries. It's a matter of switching up what Ben Anderson calls the different gehistorical styles of relating to the future. I quote, the manner through which the future announces itself, as surprise, as continuity, as repetition, and so on. The prevailing political game seeks to extract as much as it can, or provoke time-consuming internecine disputes. But this game doesn't know quite what to do with the power that these districts generate. Residents consumed by the labor-intensive struggles to make ends meet, locked into particular social formations and territorial consolidations, and repeated compensations for deficient services, also don't know quite what to do with the power that they themselves generate. This self-generated energy in various instantiations of labor, leisure, devotion, and intensity, religious, convivial, and political, It always threatens to burn itself out without new inputs. Exhaustion sets in. Energy is no longer renewable. These districts exist as intricate machines of experimentation that often goes absolutely nowhere. But what happens when this nowhere becomes more costly and deadly? When it doesn't act as an incentive or recalibration? When it doesn't invigorate the willingness to try things against the apparent grain or prevailing wisdom? Yet these districts, they hold intimate freedoms. That is the passion to expend without function, the viscosity of the street and its non-intelligible utterances, gestures and embraces. There's no social guarantor of individual integrity. On the other hand, expenditure does not accumulate social capital or debt, but on the other hand, it intensely aims to acquire these very same things. So the simultaneous presence of dissipation and self-aggrandizement has no apparent mediation. An urban tissue holds in place the plurality of activities and sentiments necessary for people to operate in close proximity to each other as both the sources of information and support, as well as inciting individualized attempts to carve out some niche. As such, it is a tissue that couples accountability and anonymity. It couples traceable lines and unknowable intersections, reachability and imperviousness, articulation and detachment, visibility and invisibility. There's just too much going on for anyone to exert an overarching claim on controlling it, even though certain figures, from headmen to Molana to party bosses to goons, loom large in people's imaginations as they deliver a neighborhood or district to various connections, electoral and symbolic projects. Political participation often takes place behind the scenes in the everyday transactions that residents, contractors, and workers have with each other. Hierarchies are everywhere. A certain few always seem to walk away with the bulk of the proceeds of a district's overall productivity. But the back alleys are also replete with ebbs and flows of success and failure, sudden spurts of money and uneven droughts. From mosque to mosque, bureaucracy to bureaucracy, and factory to factory, there are both official and unofficial emissaries suturing predictable and unexpected outcomes. Everything shifts to the side one way or another. It's possible for residents not to get stuck. At the same time, working class districts, not only in Selampur but across the world, are increasingly locked into a limited scope of maneuverability, to the reiteration of long-honed practices that do sustain particular levels of livelihood and complexions of sociality. These platforms are unable to provide great leaps, for trajectories of progressive or radical transformation that enable residents to shape the larger social urban context in ways that provide for enhanced justice and opportunity. Clearly, residents of these districts long for a different kind of life. They want both greater consumption and less arduous working conditions. Perhaps more important is their desire for exposure and access to a wider set of experiences that do not judge them for their relative ineptness, that allow them to put their own stamp on things. Yet the complex entanglements among household composition, entrepreneurial networks, financial reciprocities and dependencies, the dense fabric of everyday living arrangements, the profusion of tipping points, the multiplicity of risks and impulsive maneuvers, the intensive scrutiny of individual behavior, coupled with the indifference largely shown to individualized needs. All of these things provide a thick fabric, difficult to alter and reweave. Residents are constantly doing something, but are increasingly unsure about what that something is, what it means, and what value it has. Yet the repetition of the entanglement provides the semblance of stability. It is not necessarily a precarious life. Even as residents want something different, they do express confidence in what they have now. Their situation is largely felt as being all right. But it constantly points to the limit of what can be and what it can turn into. The attainment of stability, just this side of precarity, then becomes both a kind of security and a trap. Part of the difficulty is that change is conceptualized and marketed and consumed largely in terms of alterations to the built environment. Indeed, Selampur and other dense, heterogeneously composed districts of inextricable residence, commerce, and production are difficult to endure. They're full of massive infrastructural deficits, the intermittent supply of basic urban services, and the shortage of public institutions of all kinds. Certainly there are no technical prohibitions from making substantial in situ improvements in the physical living environment. But yet there's something in the way in which the solidity of small attainments, the thickness of the social economic fabric, the weightiness of an overused physical base, the way all intertwine and constitute a kind of protection racket by keeping things the way they are. This protection racket embodies the conditions of precluded transformation, but it also embodies a kind of motility that constantly heads somewhere inch by inch without specific destination, and even at times provides the experiential sense of movement. Complex recalibrations of things with each other often do take place, even if they are sometimes almost impossible for anyone to see. For change in a context of market inequality means an accelerated individuation of living and working spaces, or the reordering of density into larger megablocks designated as primarily residential. And this will leave many residents of these working class districts even further behind. So will the strict adherence to regulatory frameworks that specify how particular spaces are to be occupied and used, or rapid transitions to these districts becoming primarily service economies. There is a risk entailed in changing the built form of places like Selampur too quickly, because the life inside is not changing quickly. It doesn't know where to go, how to be different and still endure. Change for many residents simply means working longer hours, taking on more debt, living at a far remove from the city as the only affordable option, and having to do this largely as individuals, to have to do this largely alone. So, it's not an account of the discernible conditions that renders places like Selampur uninhabitable. Rather, it is precisely because there is no discernible scale on which to work out the conundrum that these practices that are so embedded, so much what Selampur is, exist as both protection and trap. It is very difficult to conceptualize a scale to work out how you can break through this kind of doubleness, where the very thing that makes the place secure is also what makes it a trap, and the very thing that makes it a trap in some ways makes it secure. It's simply not clear yet what would constitute a different kind of habitability with different groups. One that doesn't take 12 to 14 years from now in order to reach some clear signs of fruition, but more like 3 to 5. That doesn't have to wait for conditions of emergency or violent conflict in which transformation always assumes a particular management style. Each district will have to work with their own peculiarities of identity and history in order to configure a scale without scale, to circumvent the conundrum of their existence as both protection and trap. In Selampur, as a majority Muslim area, actual interest in Islam is really often perfunctory. Religious obligations are rigorously attended to, but the thirst for Islamic learning about the religion is minimal, reflected in the general lack of interest on the part of families to provide their children with any formal religious training. Attempting to overcome a range of obstacles, a new generation of highly educated Selampur residents aspires to new ways of life and occupations. But many also flinch at the way in which the ordinariness of middle-class life in Delhi is largely being defined in a Hindu nationalist terms and by the ruling BJP. While middle upper class Muslim colonies have developed in Delhi over the past several decades, and in Jafrabad, just north of New Selampur, has experienced a boom of new upper middle class pitched construction. Many of this new generation still live in and maintain and aspire to maintain connections with their kinship and locality networks in the older districts. They want to have these kinds of connections in a different way. In New Selampur, the group of young Muslim professionals I mentioned earlier started to meet 2 years ago in face of a seemingly minor event. They were struck by the fact that with all the engineering and other technical skills that the district possessed, these skills could never be mobilized to adequately repair the air conditioning at the mosque where they performed their daily prayers. Those that began meeting saw this deficiency as part of a larger tendency of skill and labor being locked into outmoded production and trade networks, into guilds and associations that kept reiterating individualized entrepreneurial responsibility rather than providing platforms for experimenting with how things were made and sold. So really the group came together because they had it with the fact that they had to pray with no air conditioning, and that, with the possibility that probably everyone that was there could have fixed the air conditioning, never made a move to fix the air conditioning. They recognized that the vast majority of residents in the district had a rudimentary understanding of Islam and understood their task not as extending the community's knowledge about Islam or to invigorate a more authentic or comprehensive practice of it. Rather, the task they assumed was how to translate the vernacular knowledge and words the communities did possess about being Muslim into an instrument to demonstrate how residents' work lives could work differently. In lives implemented across narrow margins, their idea was to expand the scope of lateral connections among workshops, storehouses, shops, transport practices, and distribution outlets in a way that provided new context for their everyday religiously inflected discourses that residents use with each other. So they were careful not to be seen as usurping the authority of local religious figures or local political bosses. So they organized small receptions with food and refreshment, where they simply presented short videos documenting different forms of everyday life in different parts of the Muslim world. They invited friends and neighbors and other contacts so that a mix of people from different parts of the district would show up. They encouraged the participation of families and individuals of all ages. The emphasis was basically on having a good time, of not being didactic, of not installing a particular agenda. So participants would hesitantly discuss what they saw, and over time they did so with increasing confidence. Participants in themselves began to examine the connections between what they viewed on the videos and their own life in the district. The organizing group always responded to these examinations with a multiplicity of viewpoints and possible ways of doing things. So the objective is not to build a new organization, not to generate a new economic development program for the district, but to enable at least some of its residents to envision the possible concrete steps that might make better use of the skills that they already possessed. How could these skills be used outside of the strictures of economic organization to which they were subjected, without necessarily making their position within the transaction circuits in which they are already embedded more precarious? Even as these residents worked long hours, often struggled to keep up, the idea was not to supplant their positions, but to find viable ways of supplementing them with suturing together lateral connections that might generate new prototypes, craft selected batches of new products that could be tested in markets outside of the prevailing ones. They wanted participants to consider how to generate expanded markets of internal consumption based on mobilizing skill and labor to make the delivery of local urban services more efficient and cost effective. So they always walk this kind of delicate line. You know, they wanted to sort of mobilize the words and the speech and some of the basic concepts of Islam as a way in which to enable people to recognize that they were in a much larger world than the world of Sealand. And they wanted to sort of try to illustrate that these concepts, this vernacular, could be a map of different kinds of connections that they could make with each other. But people weren't going to be motivated to make those connections if it didn't have some kind of economic sense to them. And so they really appropriated the language of new forms of entrepreneurship. Not because they really believed in the entrepreneurial, but because this is the only way in which they could sort of concretely demonstrate ways in which people could sort of deal with each other in a kind of different way. But it was walking a kind of delicate line, because you didn't want to piss off the kinds of orders, the guilds, the artisanal system. I mean, it was a delicate line. At every juncture, there were efforts to demonstrate just how all of these steps were indicative of the critical Islamic concepts of belief, faith, propriety, and propagation that populated everyday speech. This initiative attempted to prompt participants to move across the space of the district in different ways and to think of its pathways and articulations as a series of different thresholds and possibilities of action. Most importantly, it sought for residents to attend to each other, to look to and for each other, through a different ocular architecture. In other words, these efforts attempted to continue building an atmosphere about what it means to be a Muslim resident, or as Alberto Cosin and Adolfo Escalada put it, to look for each other as they look after each other. The process does not cement ties. It's not a matter of belonging or relational incorporation into established systems of meaning. Rather, these are demonstrations of elasticity, to test out and not simply assume where the hard boundaries might be. The last conclusion, coming home. I need a drink for the final run. The participants in this experiment were particularly fascinated by stories and films of Shenzhen. Not so much as a model, but as a series of occurrences and possibilities that might be harvested. Particularly interesting for them about Shenzhen was largely because it was a story about how to make unanticipated ways of urban living out of failure. The failure of state-imposed imaginaries, the failure of trying to organize life according to strict rules and parameters. I mean, that's what's interesting about Shenzhen. Shenzhen is always seen as this kind of the fastest urbanizing place in the world, this mega thing. But the really interesting thing about Shenzhen is that it's a story of failure. It's the accumulation of failure and the response to failure, which was the kind of driving thing that largely made Shenzhen. Failures that nevertheless became successful because failure opened up a space for multiple compensations that had to find ways of accommodating each other. Failure opens up a space where different things that don't usually pay attention to each other in some ways have to pay attention to each other. Well, failure indeed takes a higher toll on the ordinary. In poor and working class areas across the South, failure was once something to be absorbed. It wasn't something clear-cut. It was more of a blur. One could blur failure, move into a zone where its sting and costs could be lessened, and perhaps transformed into an incitement to try something new, try something again. Muslims across the world are preoccupied with failure. They have failed to realize nearly impossible aspirations about unity, about truly merging religious guidelines into political practice and governance. We as Muslims are preoccupied with the failure to free Palestine from Zionist rule. We are preoccupied with the failure to adequately protect ourselves from a growing wave of discrimination, as well as our failure to establish Islam as an unequivocally a religion of peace. But what was interesting for these residents of New Selampur, fascinated with the story of Shenzhen, was the productivity of failure. That they could try small things, do things in a different way, and blur the lines of who was to be blamed if things didn't work out. To blur the lines of whether something really worked or not. Their efforts take place in a city that has witnessed the active construction of middle-class imaginaries through the ascendance of local resident welfare committees acting in close partnership with various tiers of the state. These partnerships have worked to concretize such imaginaries amongst disparate districts of the city through securing spatial boundaries, supporting local entrepreneurial activities, cultivating wide-ranging networks among local activists, bureaucrats, technicians, and politicians, as well as generating various formats to promote conviviality. To a large extent, the success of the BJP in Delhi has been the success at, grassroots community organization. And although these assemblies in New Selampur may seem in some respects to mirror this general trend, there are few expectations that any partnership with the state is being furthered. Little sense of aspiration to consolidate a coherent social body. This doesn't mean that the state in its various tiers and local manifestations is not engaged in New Zealand. But it's an engagement where timing is everything, where interstices are opened up that enable low-level bureaucrats and technicians in particular to operate with sufficient autonomy and confidence to take care of different problems, such as water connections or electricity supply. Similarly then, small collaborations among participants in this project, they come and go. Daily life is too tough in order for people to be weighted down with further obligations. So everyone attempts to elicit attention, to elicit time, to elicit cooperation through whetting curiosity, providing momentary respites from the ordinary, as well as favors and support that make the management of work and household just a little bit easier. Things get fixed, but curtains are also pulled. After several months, Nuri, Malik, Sabir, Amina, Latifa, and Nabi would ask participants at the close of each gathering about what kinds of people they would wish to express themselves to. What kinds of people would you like to be in contact with? What kinds of people would you want to inform about your ideas and experiences? They emphasized that such a list was not simply to identify people in power for whom they wanted assistance or even recognition, but what kinds of people would you be curious to know or to be known to? Eventually, participants would draft communiques actually addressing those others, mostly not named as specific individuals, but sort of types of characters. I would like to be known or to know these actors or metro conductors or factory owners or school principals and so forth. As many participants were artisan, they prepared these communiques with great flourish and style in the choice of the paper they used in the embossment. Lists were drawn putting plausible names to these characters, and each communique listed the number of Nuri's parents' restaurant where contact could be made, as well as an email account and a Facebook page, which they crafted as a new form of co-working space in New Selampur. And then Shahid was then tasked with the task of delivering these communiques across the city. For as time went by, the participants sought to have a greater reach beyond the vicinity of their area. Of course, as Nuri indicated, very few calls ever came in. There was no guarantee that the communiques that were delivered were even widely read. But everywhere Nuri went in New Zealand, a district that for the most part had little idea about what he and his colleagues and about 100 residents were up to, he heard stories from others that people in their various places of work and worship and social affiliations, they were all talking about these strange occurrences in New Zealand, a series of tremors being felt in various parts of the city that had the name Sealampur attached to them. These small efforts in no way obviate the need for more extensive political projects. Explicit connections need to be drawn between infrastructure investment and its resource efficiency and distributional effects and the impact of the unsustainable and unjust path dependency of the operating systems of the city. This line of political reasoning opens up every single infrastructural system and land use plan and economic investment to close public scrutiny in terms of whether it contributes to the aggregate resource efficiency and whether it deals with differential densities in a way that can foster spatial justice for all. We need this kind of scrutiny, we need this kind of assessment. But this does not immediately address the way that states and real estate mafias and insulated elite prey off a more generalized fear of failure. It doesn't address the way in which the kind of cultivation of failure is used to try to keep people in line. There was no need for the air conditioning to fail in the mosque. But who would risk attempting to rectify the situation in front of everyone if such efforts might fail? So better let failure be a kind of default position. So this project of this sort of young group of young professional Muslims, they attempted above and beyond anything, they attempted to cultivate an atmosphere where failure might not be so debilitating. For even in their own efforts, these young professionals risk failure. They risk wasting their time and money in a place where everything seems stuck. But what ensued was a commitment on the part of the participants to pay attention to each other, to attend to their half-assed trials and errors, to lend confidence, but to not get in each other's way, to not arrive at a definitive best practice or to issue definitive judgments. In this way, they lent each other an experience of being at home. For what is home? In Toni Morrison's short novel, Home, the main protagonists, brother and sister Frank and C, find themselves forced to return to a home, Lotus, Georgia, they never really considered as home. Both saw themselves exiled there as children, never really welcomed, and anxious to take any opportunity to leave. But both failed in their journeys into a larger world, and both came back wounded and too close to death. For the younger sister, C, her repeatedly experimented upon by a racist physician obsessed with eugenics, her care was assumed by a group of elder women, each with their different approaches to healing. They took charge of her, gave her no leeway in terms of her adherence to a strict protocol of interventions that were not so much a composite of individual skills or preferences of the elders, but more a series of rhythmic alterations, women taking turns to apply their own regimen of healing. As C's condition goes up and down, as fevers come and go, each distinct intervention finds its time of application in relationship to the others and in relationship to the responses of the body to which they are applied. What women share is not so much a common approach, but a sensibility rooted in their deep knowledge that whatever they do is situated in a larger surrounds of give and take. They have an unwavering confidence in the ability to endure in an overarching environment of failure. For their blackness is worn as both knowledge that they exist in a world of darkness, but that they themselves are not in the dark. Morrison describes one of the women, an aggressive gardener, Miss Ethel. Miss Ethel blocks or destroyed enemies and nurtured plants. Slugs curled and died under vinegar-seasoned water. Bold, confident raccoons cried and ran away when their tender feet touched crushed newspaper on chicken wire placed around plants. Cornstalks, safe from skunks, slept in peace under paper bags. Under her care, pole beans curved, their strengthened to advertise their readiness. Strawberry tendrils wavered, their royal scarlet berries shining in the norming rain. Honeybees gathered to solve Elysium and drink the juice. Her garden was not Eden. It was so much more than that. For her, the whole predatory world threatened her garden, competing with its nourishment, its beauty, its benefits, and its demands. And she loved it. Here's a woman who risked failure but kept on going, knowing that she functioned in a field full of predators. So home is not a place of safety. It is not a refuge from the world. Home is not a single orientation that roots the inhabitant in security. It is a place of operations, of a multiplicity of sentiments and practices that exert a tough love on the recipient, a no-nonsense urgency to submit and adhere to a wisdom that is not yours specifically, but which is nevertheless a legacy inscribed in one's very physiology, a swirling sea of marks and traces and vernaculars, so much more than genetic. Home is a fabric of pieces, leftovers, and things discarded. It is that which all of the piecework done in Selampur and thousands of districts across the world hold on to, that don't enter the commodity chains, that mostly never get used but could. Home is always stitched together, tissue, fabric, and bodies alike. It's also not just for us to keep. In the closing lines of the novel, Frank drags a reluctant seed to the site of something they witnessed as children, a game where black fathers and sons had to fight each other to the death at the command of drunken white farmers. As kids, C and Frank had seen the body of the loser hurriedly buried. After the elders restored her to health, C joined in the common practice of quilting, of stitching together her first tissue. But in this final scene of the novel, the quilt, the tissue is sacrificed in the act of digging up the remains of that body, of wrapping it and giving it a proper home. Thank you very much.